Thank you so much, Todd. I'm really happy, really honored to be here with you guys today. See a lot of wonderful faces here. And this topic is really near and dear to my heart, and it affects everyone here in this room. As we all know, millions of farmers around the world rely on coffee as their main source of income. And although coffee has a lot of threats and challenges, there's one that faces its biggest existential threat. If you know what this is, raise your hand. Good, everyone does. This is La Roya, also known as coffee leaf rust. And this plant chokin fungus is, when it affects an area, it can wipe out entire populations of coffee. How big of a problem is it? In 2013, Costa Rica lost 60%, Guatemala 70%, and El Salvador over 75% of their coffee productions because of this fungus. That's $1 billion, and over 100,000 farmers were at the brink of starvation. It was so bad in Guatemala that the government issued a state of emergency. And with all that happened, less than 0.1% of global coffee revenue is spent on research and development. What this means is that we have this huge problem and nobody is taking it seriously. How big of a problem can this be? Really big. This is a really nice picture. It's from Ceylon, which we now know as Sri Lanka. And it's the depulping station. You can see inhabitants in the front with their bags of coffee. Most people here don't know, but I didn't know this. Sri Lanka was one of the biggest producers of coffee at one point. Over 36 million kilos of coffee was being produced on that island. And in the mid-1800s, it was wiped out completely because of this. This is an article from 1869 that talks about a vicious virus, fungus, that began to attack the island's coffee population. This was the earliest forms of La Roya that attacked the coffee-producing country. And in a matter of a few years, the entire country's coffee population was gone. And the reason why we hear a lot about Ceylon tea or Sri Lankan tea is because they began growing tea because it was resistant to this disease. And this has happened in the past. And it's a very real threat for people and farmers around the world. And if we're not careful and don't think collectively and seriously about this issue, it can happen again. How do we find a solution for this problem? I'm a big believer that we have to look at our past and know where we came from to understand where we're going. And if we look back on coffee's roots, we find keys to this, or answers to these questions. There is a difference of opinion whether or not coffee begins in Ethiopia or Yemen. But everyone can agree that the first country to begin production and commercialization of coffee was Yemen. And for those who don't know, there's actually a city in Yemen, a port called Mocha. And it was the first place where coffee was commercialized and exported. And the reason why coffee is being sold around the world. Fun fact, when we hear the word mocha, oftentimes the thing that comes to mind is this delicious coffee chocolate drink. The story behind that is that when coffee began being grown in other countries, there were certain varieties of coffee from Yemen that had very unique characteristics of chocolate. And so in these other countries, they wanted to imitate that taste. So they would put chocolate in their coffee to make it taste like the coffee that came from mocha, hence mocha. And this time period was very interesting. When we talk about coffee and the history of coffee, there's not much that's spoken about this time period from the 1400s to the 1600s, where Yemen was the only producer of coffee in the world. In that time, it was illegal to sell green seedlings to foreigners. So the only seeds that were sold were seeds that were boiled. That way the embryo in the beans would die and you couldn't grow it again. Sort of an early form of Monsanto. Bad joke. But if you did, you would be executed by Yemeni authorities. That's how much they cared about this commodity, this precious thing they had produced. The first people who consumed coffee were actually Sufi monks. They loved coffee and loved how it helped them, and they believed that God had sent down this plant to help humans reach higher states of consciousness and to stay up awake during night prayers. And there's a lot of wonderful literature that comes out this time period and poetry about coffee, which is actually an Arabic word. Qahwa means wine. And to give you an idea how coffee was produced in Yemen, this is a video that I took on my iPhone in 2013. It's hard for me to try to describe Yemen and its beauty and how they produce coffee, but this video showcases it. When people ask me, like, did the whole world's coffee production come from one country? Yeah, at one time it did. And this is a region called Bura in the western part of Yemen, and those are all coffee trees, as far as the eye can see. I remember when I first went here, first of all, it was a really crazy hike. Whenever I come back from Yemen, I usually lose a lot of weight. This first time I lost 40 pounds. I also contracted malaria and tapeworms, but that's a different story. But when I was in these village areas, I was just absolutely in shock at how amazing, how breathtaking these views were, and how serious coffee was for the livelihood of these people. What's interesting in Yemen is that it's not just they have these very unique varietals of coffee, it's that even within these varietals, they were developed and engineered for centuries. One of the areas where I work in the province of Sana'a, they have documents that talk about the coffee tax they paid to the local feudal lord, dating back 600 years. And so they have these landraces where coffee varietals were developed and engineered for centuries. And so how did coffee get from Yemen to San Francisco, California? There's different accounts and stories, but the Dutch VOC company were the first to open up shop in Mocha around the year 1616. A year later, the French and eventually the East India Company did. And so the story goes that 7 seeds were stolen out of Yemen. First by a monk named Baba Badoon, but then by the Dutch spies. And these few seeds were taken to the colony on the island of Java. And that's where the name Java comes from. Java and Mocha were these first 2 places that gave coffee to the world. Eventually, the Dutch gave seedlings to the French. This is actually a longer presentation that I love to talk about. But because of our time, and you guys eventually have to leave today, I have to keep it shorter. But it's really an amazing history of coffee spread. But in short, the French in 1721, a man named Gabriel Declus took cuttings from that and took it to the New World. That was called the noble tree. And most of the world's coffee production traces its roots back to that single tree. From there, it made it to the island of Martinique in the Caribbean, and then from there, Haiti, then Central and South America. And now Brazil produces almost a third of the world's coffee from that one noble tree, from 7 seeds from Indonesia, from Yemen and Ethiopia. It's pretty fascinating how the entire world's production of coffee comes from just a few seeds that came out of Yemen. We know the 2 major varietals that come out this time period are the Typica, where we get the Morgehepe and the Kent and Blue Mountain from, and the Bourbon that was planted on the island of Bourbon. And so this is actually a huge problem. And the reason why Ceylon was devastated by that fungus was because of monoculture. Not that many other varietals were available. And that's a huge problem. In biology, it's called genetic bottleneck. And what essentially happens is that when you don't have different varieties or a diversity in genetics, when a virus attacks, a disease attacks a coffee plant, it can destroy the entire population of coffee. So it's very important to have these varieties and this diversity. And so what can we do now today? It's hard to pinpoint where coffee begins as a plant. Based on the World Coffee Research Program, they've been doing amazing work with the Coffee Quality Institute and Texas A&M University. And there was one professor, a friend of mine named Dr. Amin Al-Hakimi, who's a coffee genetics professor from Sana'a University. And he was on a Fulbright scholarship, and based on their work, a couple of interesting things they found. This area in Ethiopia and the western mountains of Yemen is the birthplace of coffee Arabica. In the entire coffee community, or producing community, there's less than 1.2% of diversity. That's extremely low. To give you an idea, Todd was telling me yesterday that in corn in the US, we have 20% of diversity within corn here, and that's also considered low. So the entire world's coffee production is only 1.2% of diversity within those. And so I began my work in Yemen in 2013. This beautiful picture is from a mountain village in northwestern Yemen, in the area called Haraz. We actually have coffee that we're brewing for you guys today from this same area. It's very harsh, very little rainfall. Coffee is grown at 2,500 meters above sea level, making it some of the highest grown coffee in the world. Yet in this harsh environment, coffee is thriving and being grown. This is a picture, and you can see the beautiful terraces that grow coffee here. There's no shade trees. These coffees have acclimated and become used to drought. You can see that picture, that mountain in the middle, that's a village on top of that. Hiking up, that's where I lost a lot of my weight. And that person on the left, it's me trying to look like a brown Indiana Jones. And so I got to go to 32 regions in Yemen, and I zigzagged from the port of Mocha. I met these amazing farmers, heard their stories, and learned about their amazing coffee. In the process, I began to educate them on better practices, why it's important to pick ripe red cherries, paying them more for those ripe red cherries, giving them tools like moisture analyzers and building drying beds for them. And in the process, we produced some absolutely amazing coffee. It was the most expensive coffee per pound to produce. And so we brought it over here, and every single cup and table it's been on, it's always been like one of the best coffees on the table, if not the best. I remember the first time we cupped at a coffee, a roaster, it was Blue Bottle. I was really nervous because I showed up and they had a table full of these amazing coffees around the world. And I've heard it, and they had my coffee there. They didn't tell me they would put my coffee with other coffees. It was a blind taste, and there was one coffee that stood out amongst all of them, and that was our coffee. I remember James Freeman, he said, "This is what angel singing tastes like." And then another fun moment was George Howell, one of my coffee heroes, who doesn't really like natural coffees that much, rarely buys them. So when he tasted our coffees and bought one of our lots, that was a huge, huge deal for me. He told me these coffees are very unique in the way they're grown in Yemen. When coffee was produced in other countries, it was hard to produce naturally processed coffees. So that's why wash coffees happen. When you go to environments that are very humid, a lot of rainfall, natural coffees can't be produced there. But he loved the coffees, and it ended up being sold for $16 per cup, making it one of the most expensive coffees in the world. And the reaction to the consumers was they actually loved the coffee. It was wonderful, this coffee that was drought resistant and did well, but it was absolutely amazing that the coffee actually tasted wonderful, and consumers loved the coffee and bought it. So much so that the specialty coffee price index jumped 8.1% in that quarter. And they have a footnote at the bottom. And I read it, it said, one coffee in particular, the much ballyhooed Yemen Hayma Hussein al-Habat, sold by Blue Bottle, played an influential role in skewing the second quarter numbers upward. The Transparent Trade Group said that if the 173.33 per roasted pound coffee were removed, from the index, the price would fall from $24 to $22.72. This one lot of coffee they bought affected the entire price index of the quarter for specialty coffee. And in the end, I believe that it's up to us as an industry to look at this threat seriously and begin working collectively to find solutions for that. What would happen if we were able to take some of these varietals from Yemen and help give it to farmers in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Costa Rica? How many lives could we affect there? And also people here who want to taste these beautiful coffees. Yemen really brought coffee to the world, and I really believe that Yemen can help us stay here. Thank you so much for giving me this platform. I feel really honored to speak here. I feel like I'm speaking on behalf of thousands of farmers in Yemen that I work with, and it's rare that I get an opportunity to talk about this particular topic. And so I really wanted to just give a round of applause for everyone from Bloom who organized this event and allowed me to come here. Thank you so much.